So we're delighted today to welcome Professor Barbara Drossel from the University of Darmstadt, and she's the Professor of Theoretical Physics there. I actually came across Professor Drossel's work through reading something on evolutionary biology as it happens, so I'm glad to say that although we have mostly physics people this term, we do have also that arena as well being brought into this whole discussion of complexity. Professor Drossel's previously been at a number of different universities, including Manchester, MIT, Tel Aviv, and I think some others as well. So has really been around the world working in various places in her own research field, which is the whole field of complex systems. So we're delighted that she's come to speak to us today on complexity, emergence, and God. Over to you, Barbara. Here.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for inviting me to this inspiring place. It's a pleasure to tell you something about my research interests, and indeed, the majority of my research projects deal with complex systems. If you pick 10 scientists and ask each of them what a complex system is, you will most likely get 10 different answers, because there exist many definitions of complex systems. So let me start by showing you simply some pictures of those complex systems that I have in mind today. Here on the first picture you see a biological cell, which is certainly very complex. It contains several compartments where specific metabolic activities take place. The cell has a scaffold, which is the cytoskeleton. The cell has a system of tracks and transport vesicles for moving proteins from the places where they are produced to the places where they are needed, and so on. If you have never read a book on cell biology, I strongly recommend you to do so. You will be completely fascinated. The brain is another example of a complex system consisting of 100 billion neurons. The brain performs many different tasks. It receives input from outside, it sends signals to the limbs, it forms memories, it does science, it displays consciousness. Now we go to a different scale. This is a picture of an ecosystem consisting of many species. You see here plants and insects, mammals, birds. What you don't see are many other species like bacteria. I don't know if you are aware that even your body is an ecosystem. Only 1 out of 10 cells of your body is a human cell. The rest are bacterial cells. But they are much smaller than human cells, and therefore they make only maybe 1 or 2 kilograms of your weight. And there are hundreds of species of bacteria in your digestive tract helping you to digest the food. This is a complex system composed of humans. It's a medieval town. Humans are organized in families. They have different jobs. They organize the education system, the town administration, and so on. Some people call these types of complex systems also complex adaptive systems or complex organisms. Maybe you have come across one of these notions. Here's the outline of my talk. First, I would like to discuss with you the properties shared by the complex systems I have shown you. Then I want to tell you how you can do a science or physics of complex systems. You know, physicists like to explain the features of a system in terms of more fundamental principles and properties. And the main goal of my talk is to show you that the physics of complex systems is really different from the physics of classical systems, and this has philosophical and theological implications that we will discuss in the last part of my talk. So let's start with the properties of complex systems. They are composed of many interacting units. Here you see the neurons in the brain. The town that we have seen in the previous picture is composed of many people. And typically these units specialize to different tasks. In a town, people have different jobs, and they have different roles in family and society. In the brain, there are different areas specializing to different tasks. There are new features on every scale. A complex system is never boring, no matter at what scale you look at it. Here, in the smallest scale, you will perceive bacteria, unicellular organisms, then you see insects, flowers, mammals, trees, meadows, herds of animals, and so on. Complex systems respond sensitively to their environment. What you see here is a biological cell. This is the inner part, that's the outer part. Here you have a receptor molecule, and this is an insulin molecule arriving at the receptor and triggering a whole cascade of events in the cell in order to enable the cell to take up glucose and to store it. So a single molecule can trigger a large change within the cell. Complex systems also respond sensitively to small changes within the system. What you see here is a forest fire. It was triggered by a tiny little spark which represented a very small change of the system, and it has huge consequences on the scale of the entire system. This sensitivity to small changes is not particular to complex systems. You may be familiar with chaos theory. As soon as you have a system consisting of 3 parts, you may have chaos, which again displays very strong sensitivity to very small changes in the initial condition. Lorentz, who was one of the pioneers of chaos research, he coined this expression of butterfly effect. So imagine a butterfly in Brazil flapping its wings and changing slightly the flow of air in its neighborhood. This might, a few days later, turn into a tornado in Texas. So it's a very small change, can have a big effect sometime later. Complex systems can adapt to the environment. What you see here are species in an ecosystem that have adapted to the climate where they live in. You may also be familiar with the light adapting capabilities of your eye. Your eye can adjust to the average light level, and altogether the brain can adjust to 9 orders of magnitude of light intensity, which is a factor of 1,000 million in light intensity. Complex systems are shaped by their history. This tone here is shaped by who moved there when. It's shaped by big events like fires or the plague. Your brain is shaped by your experiences, by what you have seen and learned. After having summarized these properties of complex systems, let's have a look at classical systems to see the big difference. Here are 3 examples of classical systems. Here it's a chamber of gas. Here it's a crystal, it's a salt crystal. Here you have a polymer system. A polymer is a chain of molecules. Here you have 2 types of molecules, painted in red and in blue. At high temperatures, these are well mixed. At low temperatures, they separate into domains with the different types of molecules. A classical complex system also consists of many units, but the units are all equivalent, or there are very few different units, in contrast to our complex systems. So here the gas molecules are all the same. They don't specialize to different tasks. While in a complex system, all scales are interesting. In a classical system, only a few scales are interesting. In the gas, it's only the scale of the molecule and then the scale of the entire container. In this system, you have a 3rd scale, which is interesting, which is the scale of these domains here. In classical many-particle systems, large-scale properties depend in an understandable way on the units and their interactions. And the reason is that you don't have this sensitive dependence on details. So a small change on a microscopic scale has a very small effect on the system. Classical systems can be isolated. Complex systems cannot be isolated. These differences in the properties of classical and complex systems have consequences for the way of doing science. So next I would like to discuss with you the physics of complex systems. Physicists, as I said, like to explain the properties of a system in terms of more fundamental principles. The properties we are interested in are emergent properties. Emergent properties are properties that the entire system has, but that its units do not have. In a classical system, emergent properties are, for instance, pressure and temperature for this gas, which is not a feature of the single atoms, it's a feature of the entire gas. This crystal displays electric conductivity and color, which is a feature of the entire crystal, not of its atoms. Here, this polymer system shows a microdomain structure, which only occurs when you have many of these polymers together. Emergent properties of our complex systems are, for instance, the gene expression pattern in the cell. This gene expression pattern tells you which proteins are present in the cell and which are not present. Emergent properties of the brain are memory, consciousness. An emergent property of an ecosystem would be its structure. So it's the web of relations between different species and the mutual dependencies of the species. The stability of an ecosystem is an emergent property. An ecosystem persists when the environment changes. Emergent properties of social systems are, for instance, the distribution of incomes, or the age structure, or the prevalent political opinion. How do you do physics of these emergent properties? Let's start with a simple classical system in order to see the contrast to physics of complex systems. And we first discuss the experiment and then the theory that you do with these systems. A classical system can be isolated. You can put it in your lab, on your desk, and you can perform experiments. These experiments are deterministic and repeatable. These two features are closely related. So if you do the same setup again the next day, you will get the same result of your measurement. If you tell your friend what you did, and your friend does the same setup, he will get the same results. And the reason is that this very small change in the setup has a very small effect on the results that you get. The theory that you usually do for these systems is reductionistic. This means you start from the particles and their interactions, and from there you derive the emergent property. Let's take, for instance, the electric conductivity of our crystal. You start from the atoms with their electron shells, you calculate the band structure, and then you find out whether you have an insulator or a conductor or a semiconductor. The method that you use is mathematics. You perform calculations. In most cases, you cannot do exact calculations. You have to do approximations, which means you identify a small quantity and you say, I calculate to the exactness of this small quantity. And then you can become better by picking an even smaller quantity and calculating up to the size of these small quantities. A good theory is quantitatively testable. Assume you have obtained a result for the electric conductivity of your crystal. then you can go back to the beginning of your calculation, change the parameter, and calculate again the conductivity. And then you can check your result experimentally and verify your calculation. Let's now consider a complex system. Let's pick an ecosystem, for instance, this lake here. Again, let's first do experiments. Now you cannot take a complex system and put it in your lab. The reason is not so much its size, the reason is that it cannot be separated from the environment. The lake is influenced by the weather, by the temperatures, by the rain and other things falling into the lake. And if you move the lake, or let's say a little pond, from where it is into your lab, it is not the same lake anymore. So what you can do is you can isolate a small part of the system, but not the entire system. And I show you here two pictures. Here you just put some foil in the lake and you have some species here and you control who is in there, and then you study the interaction between the species in here. Or you take a jar and put some species in the jar and then you observe their interactions. If you want to study the whole system, you have only one choice. You sit in front of the system and observe it. And you cannot observe everything that's going on, so you ask a question. For instance, you observe who is eating whom. And this gives you, after some time, this picture here. That's the food web of a lake in Minnesota. Every ball is a species, and the lines indicate who is food for whom. So going up, you have the predators. So this are the top predators who are eaten by nobody else. So let me summarize the experiment on complex systems. In contrast to classical systems, you cannot isolate your system. You can only evaluate a few quantities. You cannot get an approximate complete understanding of the system. And in contrast to classical system, you cannot study exactly the same situation twice. Even if you take again the same sort of fish, put it in your jar, this fish might be less hungry. So you don't get exactly the same result. You get the same type of result, but you cannot make quantitatively precise measurements. How do you make a theory of complex systems? Just as with the experiment, you have to focus on features you are interested in, and I told you we are interested in emergent features. So we are interested in stability, let's say, and stability of food web. So we focus, among all interactions within the system, we focus on the feeding relationships. And we ask a question: how can a complex ecosystem be so stable? That's a question that has been asked for decades. If you have a simple ecosystem like a monoculture, one single type of crop, then it's very susceptible to pests. But when you have a complex system composed of many species, then it's much harder for a pest to invade the system. So obviously more complex systems are more stable. This is in contrast to what you expect from mathematics. When you have coupled system of equations describing the time evolution of a system, it's more likely to collapse when you have more species. So there has been a puzzle for many decades. How can a complex system be so stable? In order to answer this question about an emergent property of the system, we have to make a model. And the model is a phenomenological model. We cannot start with the atoms and their interactions. We have to start at a coarse-grained scale. So the theorist makes a model which does not capture everything that's in the system, but that captures those features that you think are relevant for answering your question. And typically those models are computer models. what would we do in this case? First, we write down some equations for the time evolution of the sizes of our populations. Here you see typical equation of this type. Ni is the population size of species number I, t is the time, and the population size changes in time because the species eats some food. This is the sum over all the prey species of our species I. There's a coupling term which tells you how easy or how hard it is to feed on prey number j. Of course, you get more food if there is more around. Not every prey you eat is turned into a new predator, so you have here a factor that is smaller than 1. It's maybe 10%. The next term tells you how your population decreases because you are eaten by your predators. Sum over k is the sum over all predator species. The term is similar to this one here. Then you have, of course, death, and here people also include competition. So if you set up a set of equations like this, you started with some initial values of your population sizes, then you obtain a time evolution which is plotted here for 4 different populations. This is certainly not the only way how you can set up your equations. So you are not quantitatively exact. You try to grasp the essentials of what is going on in the system. Later on, you have to play with these equations, try to modify them, to make sure that your results do not depend on the fine details of how you set up the system. You want your result to be generic and to be robust with respect to irrelevant changes of the ingredients of your model. So now we have set up our equations. Now we are going to tackle this question: how can a complex system be so stable? So we have to quantify our notion of complexity and of stability. Here you see a food web with many, many species, which obviously is complex, and we define now that a system is more complex when it has more links, which is more feeding relationships, when it has more species, and when the links are stronger, when the interactions are stronger. How do we quantify the stability of a system? Stability means you have small fluctuations in the population sizes, because then the system will not collapse when you change the environment or when you remove a species. So what we do here is a computer experiment. We start with some system, and then we just let the population dynamics run, and we see how survives. Some population sizes go down to 0, and then the species is extinct. So what you see here in this model, obviously many species go extinct. It's not very stable. And then you investigate the effect of possible ingredients in the model in order to see which factors may have a stabilizing effect on your system. And you could investigate many different things. What you see here is elephant and the mouse, so effects of body size are certainly very important. Larger animals have a slower rate of metabolism. You could include this in your equations. What you see here are frogs and tadpoles. Different life stages of a species may feed on different food. You could include this effect in your equations. Here you have the coupling constant telling you how easy it is to feed on a prey. You could make this dependent on time, because if there is more food of one type available, it's good to spend more time on searching for this food. That's essentially included in this expression here, and this is called adaptive foraging. You adapt to the prey abundances that are there. If you study the effect of all of these things on your network and on its stability, then finally you find that adaptive foraging has a very strong stabilizing effect. That's an important result several theoretical ecologists arrived at in recent years. And it makes sense. If you leave aside the prey that has a small population size and spend more time on the prey with a big population size, the prey with a small population size can recover, so it does not go extinct. So that's one of the explanations why adaptive foraging has a stabilizing effect. So this was a simple example of how you could do theoretical treatment of a complex system. Let me summarize the main features of the theory of a complex system. First point, it's phenomenological, it's not microscopic. In contrast to the theory of a classical system where you start from the atoms and their interactions. Second, the theory is incomplete. You do not capture everything that's going on in the system. You do not achieve a complete understanding. You focus on certain features and you make models for them. Third, the theory is qualitative. You do get out some numbers, but they are not very precise. In the theory of a classical system, you can improve on your results by calculating more and more digits. You cannot do this in a complex system. Let me come to the third part of my talk. What are the philosophical and theological implications? You have seen that the physics of a complex system is very different from the physics of a classical system. Let's go back to the times where people did not yet know about complex systems, where their worldview was shaped by what they learned from classical systems. Classical physics is reducible and deterministic, as I have shown you. And in particular, scientists have always tended to make a worldview out of their insights. Of course, you always have to be careful when you do this, because classical physics applies certain methods to a certain class of systems and asks only certain types of questions. It does not encompass all of the universe and all of our experiences. So making a worldview out of this is not really correct. And if you do this, you arrive at the following picture, which all of you know. God is then the watchmaker who initially created the universe, who set it up, and then the universe runs by itself by the laws that are deterministic. The initial state determines what will happen in the future. This is one of my favorite astronomical clocks. It's in the cathedral in Strasbourg. In Christian theology, we believe that God interacts with the world, with his creation, and within this worldview derived from classical physics, there's only one way how God could interact, namely by breaking his own laws. Every interference of God with our world must break the laws, because what happens is determined by the initial state of the system. So what you see here is a picture of Israelites crossing the Red Sea, the water standing like walls to the right and to the left. In principle, there's nothing wrong with the idea that whenever the invisible world interacts with our visible world, that then something new should happen, because our science can only describe what happens within this world. But nevertheless, it's not very elegant to require that God breaks his laws all the time when he interacts on a day-to-day basis with his creation. As we have seen, not everything can be described by classical physics. There are complex systems that behave differently, and this also changes our world view. Physics of complex systems is not deterministic and not reducible. It cannot be reduced to the parts and their interactions because the environment is essential. It's not deterministic because it responds very sensitively to very small changes. And this makes detailed quantitative predictions impossible. when I discuss with colleagues or with students, often I realize that they are aware of these facts, but still they believe, even though you cannot calculate the future behavior of a complex system or of a chaotic system, still the future is determined by the present state of the system. But in my view, this is a prejudice. You cannot prove it. And in fact, it's disproven by quantum mechanics. Because quantum mechanics tells you that you cannot define precisely the initial position and velocities of all the particles to arbitrary precision. The uncertainty principle tells you that the positions and the velocities can only be determined up to a certain accurateness. And this means the future time evolution of a system is not fully contained in the present state. So the worldview shaped by classical physics has to be modified to take into account the insights from physics of complex systems. Of course, we still have to be careful. Even when we take into account complex systems, we still have not taken into account everything there is, so the worldview might be modified further in the future. But we can be confident that we get closer to reality if we take into account the properties of complex systems. So the insights from complex systems are the following ones. Complex systems allow for causal openness. Causal openness means that the future is not fully contained in the present. Insights from complex systems allow for top-down causation. The opposite is bottom-up causation. That's reductionism. The particles and their interactions determine what happens on a larger scale. We have seen that complex systems are strongly interwoven with their environment, and there you have an influence of the environment on the system, which is causation from the higher hierarchical level to the lower hierarchical level, which occurs as often, or which is as important as the bottom-up causation. Let's take an example. Richard Dawkins' favorite example are the genes. For him, in his reductionistic view, the genes are the essential units that determine everything else that happens on a larger scale. But of course, you could take the top-down view and realize that the environment determines which genes survive and which don't survive. So in fact, it's the environment determining what the genes do. If you allow for causal openness and for top-down causation, then God can be in continuous interaction with his creation. He can listen to our prayers. He can guide the process of evolution. I would like to focus on these two last points a bit more. There are many instances of top-down causation that probably most of you believe in, and I have listed 3 of these here. First example of top-down causation is the laws of mathematics guiding our science. When our brain does science, it's not only the laws of physics and chemistry that determine what happens in our brain. Our science is guided by the laws of mathematics, because we do calculations and we arrive at solutions that are mathematically elegant. And in some mysterious ways, the abstract laws of mathematics guide our thinking in our brain. If you believe that at least sometimes you make real decisions, then you believe that there is top-down causation happening in your brain whenever you make a decision. Whatever the I is, this decision is something that's not predicted by the laws of physics and chemistry, but it's you who takes this decision. Recently I read about a very fascinating example of top-down causation. Probably most of you know the work of Professor Simon Conway Morris on convergent evolution. And he points out that many organisms arrive at the same biological solutions independently from each other. For instance, the camera eye exists in the vertebrates and also in the octopuses. Or different species have invented music. It's not just us humans, it's also the birds and the whales. And there are many features shared by all these types of music. And there are many, many more examples of convergent evolution. And Simon Conway Morris writes about an abstract metaphorical landscape through which evolution has to navigate. So not everything is possible. On the contrary, certain things are bound to happen. And that's also an example of top-down causation. I already mentioned that the first 2 points allow that God is in continuous interaction with his creation. And if you look into the Bible and you look at, not at the special events, but at God's everyday interaction with the world, it's interesting to see that this usually happens through complex systems. Let's just look at some examples. God often influences the weather in the Bible. That's not a complex system in the sense I have used this term today, but it's certainly a chaotic system which is causally open. Here you see a picture of Jonah being in the storm because he is fleeing from God. You know about the story of the drought at the time of Elijah, or Jesus calming the storm. There are many examples in the Bible where God influences the weather, which is in no contradiction whatsoever with any law of physics, because the weather is a causally open system. In the Bible, you often see God speaking to people, for instance, to the prophets. Here, this is a picture of Abraham receiving his promise that he will become a big people. God often influences animals. What you see here is the fish swallowing Jonah. You may also think of the locusts in the prophet of Joel eating the harvest of Israelites. You have many stories in the Bible where God influences sickness and health. Again, this is a complex system. They need not break any law of nature when somebody becomes sick or healthy again. Here you see a picture of the king Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah visiting him, telling him he has to die, and then Hezekiah prays. Then God tells Isaiah to go back to Hezekiah and tell him he will recover. Okay, let me summarize what I have tried to show you in my talk. First, we have seen that classical systems are reducible and deterministic, and so is physics of classical systems. In contrast, complex systems are not deterministic. They are unpredictable. They cannot be reduced to their parts. They are interwoven with their environment. They are open. And this has consequences on the worldview if we want to include in our worldview insights derived from sciences. In a worldview derived from classical systems, God has limited possibilities to interact with the world. But if you take into account that there are complex systems, then you are getting much closer to the view that the Bible teaches us, that God can continually interact with his creation in a natural way. And for me it's very encouraging to see that the worldview from science gets closer to what we have been revealed through the Bible, through our experience and our faith. That's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm going to ask you to stand in the middle, and perhaps we can. No, you switch this thing off, but I'm not blinded by it. That's okay. Thank you very much. We've got some good time now for questions and discussion, so that's great, and it's really over to you to. Yes, turn, Joe.
I wanted to ask you a question about. You mentioned the example of quantum mechanics, which
Yes.
has uncertainty in it. So there is an inbuilt uncertainty in the system. However, quantum mechanical calculation, let's say you are calculating properties of a quantum magnetic systems at zero temperature. They are quite predictable and experimentally verifiable, unlike the classical systems which you work on, which are not predictable and not verifiable experiments.
Not all of the world is unpredictable and irreducible. There are certainly subsystems that are predictable and usable. And quantum mechanics, to a large part, falls into the first category of being classical system, because the Schrödinger equation is a deterministic equation, and it's reducible because you usually set up a many-particle Schrödinger equation which includes the particles and their interactions. So that's a good reducible deterministic model. But then you have the process of measurement, which is usually not included in the calculations that most physicists do when they calculate some property of a quantum mechanical system. But this process of measurement is irreducible, it's indeterministic, and it's irreversible. So it displays two features that are not features of the Schrödinger equation. And this tells you that there's another side to quantum mechanics which points to what we have also learned from complex systems.
No, what I was talking about is you have, when you do measurements,
Yes.
you measure some observable quantities, just an observable. And you could say that that observable was calculated using quantum mechanics. So that observable quantity is an emergent phenomenon of quantum mechanics.
What I mean is,
Compared-
in measurement process, you get one possible outcome out of many, and you can only give probabilities for the outcome of a measurement. So that's indeterministic. And the measurement itself cannot be described by quantum mechanics, at least according to my belief. There are theories who try to describe it, but we can discuss it later.
Okay, thank you. Yes, question in front of you. Yes,
I have a question about the inherent stability of complex systems that you were talking about, because I'm not quite certain that I got the point that you were making. But I do see, I suppose, to a certain extent, that if you look at the sun as a complex system, there is an inherent stability about it, and look at it that way round, that says, yes, the sun will rise and it'll be the same sun that comes up every morning. And look at it like that, and regard that as an example of a complex system working in the way that complex systems work. Now, there could be some event that makes the sun blow apart at some point, but there is an inherent stability. And I'd just like you to explain that difference between looking at these things as complex systems, which I think answers some of the previous question, rather than just seeing them as classical, simple, reducible systems. Why they're so
Take
stable.
that the sun rises every morning, that's the law of gravitation, which belongs to classical physics, which is very predictive. Not in our real world, there are always things that are stable, and there are other time evolutions that are not stable. When you have a very close look at the sun, there is a lot of motion going on. The sun has an atmosphere and it's pretty turbulent, so there you have the unpredictable, indeterministic behavior. But you're referring also to the stability of ecosystems. Of course, our world persists and has persisted for a long time, so many of its features are pretty stable and robust. It's, some things that are robust, some things that are not. Could I better say it?
Okay.
Who's next? Actually, I have a question which I agree with you in totally. I mean, you made a passing comment about Richard Dawkins and genes. You know, I mean, genes are not a recipe for things that somehow make cakes and sort of cook up organisms. That it's a complete system operating together. Now, Dawkins has another argument you may have come across that actually is an argument against the existence of God. You know, that you can't sort of infer to the best explanation God in terms of explaining the universe, because that's invoking something very much more complex. I mean, this comes under complexity theory. So therefore, invoking something very, very complex isn't really an explanation for other complex things at all. Do you want to comment on that? Have you come across this argument, and do you have any comment on it?
It's
Or is that too theological?
a different type of explanation.
Yes.
I mean, as a physicist, you try to simplify things and to derive properties from more fundamental properties. But when you ask, why is there anything at all, and who is the source of everything, why should the source not be the most complex, the most real individual that exists?
Any theologians want to comment on that? Yes.
So I've asked a separate question, but
Okay. Well, just before we move on, I know some people have written on this, and they might want to just look in the back row. Okay, Patrick, do you want to make any comment on that?
Well, first, in fairness to Dawkins, though some aspects of his thought are perhaps fairly described as reductionistic, he isn't a genetic determinist, and he certainly would say that the theory of natural selection acting on random mutation certainly does involve the environment. That's essential to it. And if you're accusing him of not taking that into account, I think he would rightly feel that he's been traduced. So I think, in fairness,
These are the objects that determine it.
what Dawkins there is saying is that it's helpful to view things at the genetic level, and that helps you solve problems like how does altruistic behaviour evolve and things like that. He's not saying that genes determine everything or that the environment isn't important.
He says, for instance, we are the survival machines, not to help genes survive, and it's the survival of genes that is the issue.
Yeah, but that's to do with a sort of teleological metaphor. If you're looking for the design function of the universe, Dawkins thinks it's easier to explain it in terms of at the genetic level rather than at the organism level. It isn't a point about the reductionism of everything to genes. It's about how best do we look at this system and see what it's doing. But he's using metaphors, and he actually acknowledges that talking about selfish genes may have been a mistake because everybody understood it in terms of selfishness at the human level, which he wasn't saying. But that's just an aside. I think you ought to be more careful if there's a Dawkins in the audience about that level. But if you're saying that God is the most complicated thing, surely you're violating Occam's razor, which isn't important only in physics, but in all of science and in all of philosophy. I mean, it's contrary to good philosophy to multiply causes. And if you're saying that God is a complex being, the most ultimately complex being, then you've multiplied entities ad infinitum. You're saying that God is composed of an infinite number of ideas, or that God has an infinitely complicated brain, or something like a brain, a computer. And if you're not saying that, then in what sense is he complex?
Getting deep waters here.
So,
Can you move over a little bit, Barbara, just for
Yes.
filming, just so I'm not in your way? Yes.
I mean, the question of the God is on a completely different level, so it's really hard for me to talk about it in scientific terms because God is beyond science. So even when you just try to describe God by using terms from our language, of course it's always failing or missing the point, of course, yeah. And Occam's razor applies to scientific explanations or to within the world explanations. I mean, God is the ultimate cause is on a different level.
Classical theologians have usually said that God is simple and without any parts at all. And that's probably a better response to Dawkins than that, oh dear, well at this point we bail out and say all our language is meaningless.
You cannot have nothing from, or something from nothing. I mean, if our world is so beautiful and complex, this cannot come from nothing.
Agree.
Yeah.
Okay, we had a question down here first, and then we'll go back to this.
I mean, a quick comment if I can before going on to the question. As a computer scientist, I don't take Occam's razor that seriously. I don't feel that bound by it. I mean, who was Occam to be a dogma? So, good point there. When we create computer systems these days, we don't use it at all. We don't want parsimony necessarily because it's not going to be a good system. The question I was going to ask you is a different question, and that is, if I were to attempt to simulate a complex system like the human brain using something like a powerful computer, and that's what we're trying to do, would that powerful computer possess the same emergent properties as the human brain? For example, consciousness.
Good question. We will learn a lot from doing this experiment. But the point is, to simulate the entire brain is a horrific task because the brain consists of so many neurons and does so many things. So I think it's still far in the future till we'll be able to model something like a brain. And maybe the model will be a one-to-one model, then you've gained nothing. If we just put all the parts together again and see, okay, we get a brain, we have learned nothing. So.
Okay, yes, there's a question in the back there, yes.
You draw a clear distinction between classical and complex systems, but could you not say it's possible that our theories at the moment aren't capable of breaking down a complex system into its classical components, and that they're just interacting in very complicated ways that we don't understand?
I don't think so, for two reasons. One is the complex system is always embedded in the environment and cannot be isolated. That's a fundamental difference.
Could you say that a classical system is ever possible to isolate in a sense, because within our universe
The systems that I've shown you can be isolated. And the other thing that I have tried to point out is that you have the sensitive dependence on the initial conditions, which also is a feature of chaotic systems. And whenever you have this very sensitive dependence, in order to predict the system, you would have to know to a very high precision the initial configuration. And that comes in quantum mechanics. You cannot fix the initial condition to the precision that you would need to fix it in order to have a deterministic system. That's an uncertainty principle which tells you cannot. That's a fundamental limit. So it's not just that we don't know enough in order to measure the initial condition more precisely. It cannot be defined more precisely.
Do you want to come back on that, or?
Well, I mean, then if you included that inherent uncertainty within your model, could you not break down an arbitrarily complex system into a sum of quantum mechanical probabilistic models interacting in very complicated ways?
Probabilistic behavior, which is not completely predetermined. And still you would have the interaction with the environment.
But are you then saying that quantum mechanics is a complex theory inherently?
Quantum mechanics explains why a chaotic system is not deterministic. It's because you cannot pin down the initial state to more than a certain precision.
Okay, there was a question recently over here, yes.
I just wanted to come back to the earlier discussion here is the idea of God as a bailout as the ultimate complex system, but that's not what I took you to be saying, but maybe I misunderstood, so I just want to try to clarify it. I thought that you were trying to use complex systems as a way of invoking the plausibility of higher order or second order, or use more historical terms, secondary qualities, some other sort of property that's not reducible. A fortiori, why can't we have a God who acts in such and such a way that's not reducible to terms that we're accustomed to? I thought that's what you were saying overall in conclusion, but maybe not. I mean, did you mean it, your overall argument to run in that way? And if so, then that counters what he was saying, but I'm not sure I got what you were saying. Were you just trying to
what
argue
I was
the
saying in the
plausibility?
talk is that what we learn from complex systems opens the possibility that God is in continuous interaction with the world, without breaking the laws of nature all the time. That was what I was saying in my talk. And then there was this question how I would define God, and shall he be simple or complex? And that's a completely different type of question, which is not scientific but theological. So I would prefer other people to give the answer.
Yes.
Coming back just on that same point, in the sort of definition of miracle as what miracles actually are, on the sort of, you seem more comfortable with the sort of theistic idea that God can somehow intervene or be a part of a complex system without necessarily going against the laws of nature. And to some extent, I think that was sort of helping, as I understood it, you to explain God's intervention. But it seems to me that on another level, traditionally, perhaps miracles are understood as God breaking the laws of nature or going against his laws of nature. And there's nothing illogical about that.
Yes.
And I don't, to my mind, I don't have a problem with that. I think that's quite helpful, because that's how we know that God is there or intervening.
That's what I was trying to say with the picture of when I showed the picture of the Red Sea.
Yes.
I mean, I think for God's everyday interaction with the world, it would be not elegant if he needed to break the laws all the time. But certainly there have been special events, the main event being the resurrection of Jesus, which are miracles. And I like the statement by C.S. Lewis, when a poet deviates from his rhythm pattern or his rhyme scheme, he just does it because he cannot say what he wants to say following his scheme, then he's a bad poet.
Yes.
But if he achieves a special effect by deviating, he follows a higher law, and then it makes sense. And that's how I would view miracles. If there is some higher reason for doing what God does, then of course why not deviate from the laws, because it's kind of interaction of the invisible world with our world, which cannot be described by our science, obviously.
Thank you. Of course, in biology we don't have laws anyway, as you know, so we just have evidence, and so we don't worry about those sort of things. I mean, to us, laws are just simply, if you like, from a theistic perspective, God's normal activities, which happen to be summarized by physicists by these grand things with a big L, but so I just throw that into the equation. But we've got time for one more question. Yes, actually, let's have someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Yes.
Let me just ask, you said that you, in complex systems, there is the possibility of God intervening in this rather subtle way, as opposed to miracles with classical physics. Do you, you say God can intervene in this way. Do you personally think that he does?
Yes, certainly. I mean, whenever I pray, of course I believe that God hears in response to it, otherwise it wouldn't make sense to pray, for instance. So if you pray, you believe that God can interact with you and with the world on a day-to-day basis.
With the things you quoted, like the weather and the human brain, and well, that would cover prayer and so on. But you do personally think that he not only can, possibly may, but does.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Good. Well, I think that's probably a very good note on which to finish, the fact that God does answer prayer and God does interact with the world. And I think we want to really thank Barbara again. We've given her quite a hard time, the questions, and really want to thank her again for a very fascinating talk and lots more to think about indeed. So thank you very much, Barbara.